So I want to introduce this panel in a minute, but I want to just for a second tell you how we all got to this room, because it has to do with one of our speakers, Congressman McGovern. In September of 2016, my brother Joe Scarry and I went to Congress and asked 10 offices if they would begin to address the problem of presidential first use. And we proposed to them several solutions, which they felt had uneven reactions to. But we suggested that they have a hearing on presidential first use. There had been one in 1976. And though they had reacted unevenly to our suggestions, to that suggestion, they uniformly said, fresh idea, fabulous, wonderful, but only the majority party can initiate a hearing. And so by the time we got to Congressman McGovern's office, just by the accident of scheduling, it was fairly late in this process, we said, we want you to have a congressional hearing, but of course we know you can't initiate this until you become the majority party. And suddenly from the other side of the office was a voice saying, why don't you hold the hearing at Harvard until we can have the hearing in Congress? And this conference that we're having here today is that kind of shadow hearing until it can be held where we can actually subpoena presidential witnesses and so forth. And it was the suggestion of Jim McGovern. By the way, a family member of his own was sick at the time, but rather than canceling this riff-raff brother-sister team, he and his legislative assistant, Cindy Buell, scheduled us for dawn and met with us despite the fact that he was about to leave for this family problem. Jim McGovern is the U.S. Representative of Massachusetts 2nd District, first co-sponsor of the Markey Liu Bill, prominent congressional voice on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's one story that you may know, I think it's an important story to know about Jim McGovern. In 1989, he was working for Congressman Moakley, who asked him to be the lead staffer in the investigation of the murders of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper and her daughter in El Salvador. He exposed the fact that the murders were committed by the U.S.-backed Salvadorian military, leading to a major shift in U.S. foreign policy. After Jim McGovern's discovery, future military aid from the U.S. was contingent on improved human rights and a negotiated peace in El Salvador. Doesn't get much better than that. Kennette Benedict is another one of my heroes. I think all of you know the doomsday clock from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which one person, design expert, has says is the greatest piece of information design in the 20th century. And maybe one of you will design the greatest piece of information design for the 21st century in helping people to address this problem. Kennette Benedict was the executive director of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and is presently the senior advisor to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and a lecturer at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. She was also, for a long time, the director of international peace and security at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, overseeing grant-making on a broad international security agenda, as well as supporting efforts to reduce the threat from weapons of mass destruction. Kennette works humanely and generously with the community of science and expertise in making public engagement as effective and impactful as possible. Hugh Gusterson, yet another hero in my view, is an anthropologist who teaches at George Washington University and is president of the American Ethnological Society, and author of books about executive weapons, nuclear weapons. His 2 best-known books, Nuclear Rites, a Weapons Laboratory at the End of the Cold War, and People of the Bomb, Portraits of America's Nuclear Complex. But more recently, a book on drone warfare called Drones, Remote Control Warfare. He's also the recipient of the 2013 President's Award from the American Anthropological Association and the 2014 Scholars Award from the National Science Foundation.
Well, first of all, let me thank Elaine for the very generous words. I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say after that build-up. But I want to thank her. I want to thank Jonathan. I want to thank Cole, all the organizers. Too many to mention here today, but I'm very grateful to all the co-sponsors who took the initiative, joined together, and organized this incredible conference. This is what citizen engagement looks like, and it's really uplifting for me, and I know it was for Senator Markey, to see so many people here on a Saturday afternoon. You know, this morning's panels describe the lay of the land, if you will, of the decision-making that comes into play when we think of the unthinkable: nuclear war, using a nuclear weapon, a nuclear exchange, and what is the constitutional limits on the president, if any, when it comes to using nuclear weapons. I say unthinkable because for over 70 years, the idea around nuclear deterrence is that we have these terrible, destructive nuclear weapons to make sure that we don't use them. They used to call it MAD, and it is MAD. It's totally insane, but it is still the international framework for restraint. Within that framework, nuclear disarmament treaties, many bilateral, some multilateral, have come into being that have significantly decreased the number of weapons in the U.S. and Russian arsenals, eliminated nuclear above-ground testing and nearly all below-ground testing, curtailed nearly all countries from acquiring or developing nuclear weapons, and restrained those nations that have nuclear weapons from acquiring new ones. These are no small accomplishments, and Congress has enshrined most of these into U.S. law, either by ratifying treaties or by authorizing and funding, implementing, and monitoring programs. And I firmly believe that Congress would not have acted without a very engaged citizenry. So here we are today. And speaking for myself, I don't believe that I've ever been so worried about a possible nuclear confrontation in my life. Using a nuclear weapon can be triggered very quickly and then can escalate so rapidly that before we know it, we are in a nuclear war. As I'm sure you heard this morning, the National Command Authority is very simple. The President makes the decision to use nuclear weapons, and the Secretary of Defense executes the order. If that doesn't scare the hell out of you right now, I don't know what will. Once the decision is made and in the process of being carried out, our systems of checks and balances don't apply. Congress couldn't stop it. The Supreme Court couldn't stop it. And the way it's set up, not even the Secretary of Defense, in theory, has the authority to stop it. Quite frankly, this is far from what the framers of the Constitution had in mind when they drafted and adopted this foundation of all our laws and democratic institutions. The framers gave the power to declare war to Congress. And this is the motivation and the reason and the foundation for why H.R. 669 and S. 200, the Restricting First Use of Nuclear Weapons Act, were introduced by Congressman Ted Lieu of California and our own Senator Ed Markey, as you heard here today, in January of this year. This bill, let me repeat it again, prohibits the president, and let me be clear, it prohibits any president and every president from using U.S. armed forces to carry out a first-use nuclear strike unless Congress has declared war and authorized such a first strike. It's that simple, and it's that straightforward. And I'm proud to be an original sponsor, in fact, the very first co-sponsor of the House bill. H.R. 669 has 72 co-sponsors, which is not a bad beginning. But as Senator Markey pointed out, we need to increase the pressure. And here in Massachusetts, we have 9 members of Congress. 2 of us are on the bill, myself and Catherine Clark. Everybody else hasn't got on the bill yet. And so and Elaine began this meeting today by reading all the towns and cities off where everybody's from. You are all in those representatives' districts. Get them on this bill and make a point to call them next week. And I'm going to say, sadly, too, in the House, only one of the co-sponsors is a Republican, and that is my friend and colleague from North Carolina, Walter Jones. This shouldn't be a Democratic or a Republican issue. This is a common sense issue. And quite frankly, we need to make sure that everybody feels the pressure. The bill also clearly defines that first strike means an enemy has not launched a nuclear weapon against the United States or an ally of the United States. If another country launches a nuclear weapon at us, the president does have the right to proportionate self-defense under international law, although what that term means might have been discussed earlier today. Some might argue that prohibiting the U.S. from striking first with a nuclear weapon ties the president's hands and makes the U.S. vulnerable to attack. I know that former Secretary of Defense William Perry, a true champion of rational nuclear disarmament, has noted that there is no scenario where the U.S. military couldn't respond as a first strike with devastating force using our existing conventional arsenal. This includes our B-2 bombers, our cruise missiles, our Tomahawks, our non-nuclear ICBMs, and a huge range of weaponry. We have seen the destructive capacity of our conventional first strike weapons in Iraq and Afghanistan, regardless of what we might individually think about those wars, and I like them to be brought to an end as soon as humanly possible. So we are not weak, or we are not vulnerable. We have many options to take the initiative and strike first for retaliation. Nuclear retaliation, let alone first strike, is not needed. And let me say for the record, the Democrats were strongly pushing President Obama to adopt a no first strike policy when he was in office. So this is not just about President Trump. This is something that we have been contemplating for quite some time. But it will take many more co-sponsors, as I said, for this bill to have any chance of moving in the House or the Senate. It will take the Republican leadership of Congress being a lot more nervous about the possibility of the president actually launching a strike for them to advance these bills. And meanwhile, we have the president backing away, as Senator Markey pointed out, from the hard-won international agreements to keep nuclear weapons out of the hands of the Iranians. And we have him exchanging ever more heated taunts with a nuclear-armed North Korea. This is why the Markey-Liu bill is so absolutely necessary. Congress needs to assert its constitutional authority not only when it comes to war, and most especially when it comes to the catastrophic possibility of nuclear war. On North Korea, I'm proud to have also joined with Senator Markey and Representative Conyers to introduce bipartisan, bicameral legislation to reaffirm Congress's constitutional power over a first strike on North Korea. H.R. 4140, the No Unconstitutional Strike Against North Korea Act, was introduced last week with 60 co-sponsors. 2 of them are Republicans. The bill restricts any funds for being used to launch a military strike against North Korea without prior approval from Congress. That's any strike, not just a nuclear strike, because war is war is war. And only Congress has the right to declare it and authorize it. I'm very proud to have helped lead a letter addressed to President Trump with my good friends and colleagues, Congressman Conyers and Congresswoman Barbara Lee from California, responding to the President's wildly erratic comments threatening military action against North Korea. We had 64 Democrats sign that letter. At the beginning of October, Congressman Seth Moulton here of Massachusetts helped coordinate a letter also addressed to the President on the same topic, signed by 68 Democrats. That letter described a better approach to North Korea, emphasizing diplomacy, economic pressure, and crisis management. Now, we don't have the time to go into this, but one of the things that also worries me is that I think President Trump actually believes that we have some kind of missile defense system that will knock out all of North Korea's nuclear weapons out of the sky if they were to launch a nuclear weapon, and there's no such thing exists to be able to guarantee the protection of ourselves and our allies. These current crises, as threatening and as frightening as they are, really speak to the underlying and long unresolved crisis of nuclear weapons themselves. As you know, President Obama began a program of so-called nuclear modernization. President Trump has doubled down on that proposal to modernize, update, and create new nuclear weapons. The Congressional Budget Office, known as CBO, just came out with a report on Wednesday that estimates the cost of President Trump's plans to maintain and replace the U.S. nuclear arsenal over 30 years would cost $1.24 trillion. This is $200 billion more than the last estimate, and when you factor in inflation, the price tag soars to $1.7 trillion. These costs are simply unsustainable. They threaten the entire federal budget, including the rest of the military budget. But what is also important about the CBO report is that it lays out several different options for improving our military force structure that are much more cost-effective. This is important because the Pentagon likes to paint its proposals sometimes in very stark terms. Either give us everything we ask for, or we're all going to die. That's a false choice, and the CBO report lays that out very clearly, providing multiple options to choose from instead. However, I still believe, and I believe this quite fervently, that the best choice the United States can make and that the world can make is to eliminate nuclear weapons altogether. Now, I realize that this can't be done in a day. I'm not a fool. But my fear right now is that there has been a shift in thinking about among the nuclear powers, not just the United States and Russia, but also France, the UK, and China, not to mention India, Pakistan, and North Korea, that nuclear arsenals must be protected and updated and increased with an eye to the inevitable use of a nuclear strike against an enemy in the foreseeable future. The nuclear powers are hunkering down and going in the wrong direction, while the rest of the world is moving towards a demand for total nuclear disarmament. Not too long ago, that was at least the future goal of nuclear powers: careful, verifiable, incremental disarmament, while ensuring that no other nation acquired nuclear weapons capabilities. But I really fear for the current moment. We have members of Congress who think using a nuke against North Korea or Iran is not just something we should think about, they believe it is something we should do. We will really need an engaged citizenry, a large-scale movement to change the direction. As Senator Markey pointed out, the nuclear freeze movement began right here in Cambridge. I think it's time to get moving again. It's time once again to remind our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers that these are issues that affect every single American family, every single one of us. In a very busy world where families are focused on picking up their kids from school, wondering how the economy is going to affect their jobs and their grocery bills, there is one more sure thing that we all need to remember. A nuclear war will kill us all. Quickly or slowly, it will kill all of us. Nuclear war not only devastates the people where it falls, it would over time devastate the world as we know it. That was once commonly an understood fact, but it's been forgotten in the press. Because so many other crises and other hardships have moved to the forefront. It is time to remind everyone, including every single member of Congress, what the reality is. It is time to rebuild this movement across ages, across regions, across cities, towns, suburbs, rural communities, across genders, across races, because a nuclear war will devastate us all. It's important to remember, though, how different the times are now than when the freeze movement was organized. We no longer have a Democratic Congress. We don't even have a moderate Republican Congress. We have a very conservative Republican-controlled House and Senate that have never moved forward any legislation outside their own narrow agenda. And we have a very unstable, volatile, erratic White House. So this is the moment. In 1978, I was a college intern in the office of Senator George McGovern, no relation, but one of my heroes. And I had the privilege of attending a debate that he had with William F. Buckley, Jr. At Yale University. And the debate was entitled, "Resolved that the SALT talks are in the interest of U.S. national security." Now, Senator McGovern concluded his closing remarks by referring to a 1963 debate on the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And here's what he said that night at Yale. He closed by saying, Senator Everett Dirksen took to the floor to close the debate. He said that he had just reread John Hersey's Hiroshima, the description of what happened to that great city the morning after. The scene of one family sitting charred around the breakfast table, out in the yard, bits and pieces of children's clothing, the broken arm of a doll, toys and debris scattered over the landscape. And he said, I thought about that scene, and I said that someday Everett Dirksen will be buried in Illinois, and when that happens, I don't want them to put on my gravestone, he knew about this and he didn't care. Well, you being here today shows me loudly and clearly that you care. And we need to build this movement, and time is of the essence. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see all of you. I want to thank Elaine Scarry and the organizers, of course, for the conference, but I also want to thank all of you for being here and listening and being part of what I think is going to be a fantastic movement to get rid of nuclear weapons, at least if we listen to Senator Markey and Representative McGovern. As we've heard from both of them, citizens have been at the forefront of reducing the risks of nuclear weapons. Not only was there the freeze movement in the 1980s in response to Reagan's call for a buildup of nuclear weapons, and the invigoration of the Committee on Nuclear Disarmament in Europe, that freeze movement not only made a difference here in the United States, but arguably it led to the end of the Cold War. It supported Gorbachev and Reagan in their interest in dramatically reducing weapons in the Soviet Union and in the United States, and really changed the course of history. Before that, in the 1950s, we also saw a citizens' movement to stop testing, atmospheric testing. Doctors had found strontium-90 in babies' teeth and in mothers' breast milk, and citizens were outraged that these weapons testing programs should hurt them directly and came out on the streets protesting that. And even before that, almost as the birth of the nuclear weapons, at the birth of nuclear weapons, the citizens' movement of scientists was born at the University of Chicago. These scientists who'd helped build the nuclear weapon, the first atomic bomb, understood perhaps better than any in 1945, even before the first test at Trinity in July, that these weapons could incinerate people and cause truly horrific and extensive damage, and led by James Franck, wrote a report to the government saying that these weapons should not be used on civilians, they were indiscriminate, and that they should be tested first in a demonstration project to show the Japanese leadership how terrible they were, rather than first dropping them on civilians. So from the very start of the nuclear age, citizens, scientists as citizens, doctors as citizens, mothers as citizens, everyone as citizens, have contributed to reducing the risks of nuclear weapons, reducing the arsenals of nuclear weapons. And most recently, we've seen another private group of citizens, non-governmental organizations in the form of the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, organize pretty much the world to come up with a new treaty that would ban nuclear weapons through the auspices of the UN. So it's clear to me that citizens have an enormous responsibility and have had enormous success. In fact, perhaps they've had, among all these bodies, the most success in reducing the risks from nuclear weapons. I will confess, though, that until now it's been difficult to see how Congress has actually checked executive power to build and potentially use nuclear weapons. So these recent legislative proposals, along with the earlier ones of the freeze movement, are really quite heartening and especially the proposal to prohibit presidential first use would certainly curtail the executive power to launch attacks. Now, what has prevented Congress in the past from acting on clear citizen preferences for nuclear weapons reduction? There are two things I think that many experts point to as reasons not to allow non-experts, congressional members, as well as ourselves, to have any say in nuclear weapons policy. The first is speed. They suggest that in order to retaliate against a surprise attack, or even to deter a surprise attack, that you need to do it very quickly, and the executive and the military are the only ones who are able to do that. After all, Congress is a deliberative body. It was set up to be that way, to take many views into account. And it's just impossible for a legislature to be able to quickly respond to a dire emergency. The second is the question of secrecy. Since the beginning of the nuclear age and the development of the bomb in World War II, the expert community and the military have tried to prevent our enemies from learning about our plans. This was clearly born of the Manhattan Project and World War II, as well as the Cold War, to keep information about our nuclear arsenals, our newly developing weapons from our enemies. The irony, of course, is that our enemies quickly managed to get that information. And in fact, the idea of secrecy hasn't worked very well. The Russians in 1949 tested their first nuclear weapon, and in 1953 a thermonuclear weapon. And so it was really pretty easy for them. The knowledge was there. There wasn't much that was being kept from them. On the other hand, secrecy has prevented us, has prevented citizens and our representatives from gaining the knowledge we need about nuclear weapons capabilities and costs, about the war plans that are being constructed. And secrecy is often used to cover up mistakes and accidents, which further empower the executive branch. So we're kept in the dark, our enemies know a lot, and the executive enlarges its power. The result of all of this is that the people have no voice in the most significant decision the United States government can make, whether to destroy another society with weapons of mass destruction and in turn risk being destroyed ourselves. Elaine Scarry brilliantly and rightly calls this a thermonuclear monarchy. Gary Wills refers to this as bomb power in a very short and effective book written in 2010. For Robert Dahl, a political scientist from Yale, writing in a book in 1986, Controlling Nuclear Weapons, he argues that citizens are really treated as children who are thought to have no expertise or knowledge and thus no right to participate in how nuclear weapons are developed and deployed. He suggests that the people are wards of the state, that we exercise the rights assigned to us only by the guardians of the arsenal, his phrase. Without congressional deliberation and citizen participation in the gravest decisions of life and death, democracy, of course, is greatly diminished, if we can even call ourselves a democracy at all. And our rights to life and liberty are completely abridged. Seems to me this leads to the complete disempowerment of citizens. If we can't make decisions about these most fundamental, consequential issues of war and peace, life and death, it undermines and trivializes our own rights and disempowers us, and I think it delegitimizes Congress, which is supposed to be our representative, if they cannot participate in the most consequential decisions that our country can make. So, what are the remedies? How can we change this? What can happen? Well, first of all, let's reduce the speed. There is no need, really, for the kind of speed that people argued we needed during the Cold War. where we were worried about a surprise attack from the Soviet Union. So take weapons off of a high alert status. This is Bruce Blair and several others. Bill Perry has also said that we need to reduce the launch readiness. And in reducing the launch readiness, then you give a chance for more people to participate in the decisions about what to do in the face of an attack. Let's reduce secrecy. If we're going to make decisions about nuclear weapons, we need to know about them. The State Department in April of 2015 finally officially published the numbers of weapons and declared the numbers in our arsenals as well as those awaiting dismantlement. In May 2016, the Defense Department did the same thing. And thanks to experts in the scientific community, since 1987, we've published estimates of how many nuclear weapons and have been able to inform citizens. We published them in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and now they're available online from the Federation of American Scientists. Hans Christensen, I think, should be given a Nobel Prize, frankly, for making these estimates available. That's the only reason that we know how many weapons we have, the Russians have, China has, India, Pakistan. It's because of those informal published estimates. Another way to reduce secrecy is for congressional members and outside experts to participate in the nuclear posture review that the executive, the president, and the military conduct from time to time. This, I know, to many will be heresy. What do you mean? How can we mess around with the nuclear posture review? It has to be a part of the decision-making that we have a right to know what the war plans are. These are war plans that are in place, as you heard earlier this morning, every minute of every day. And yet we have no clue what they are. They are not publicly available. They are not something that we are allowed to see. But it seems to me if we're going to make intelligent decisions, feel empowered, that we need to understand more about these, and there must be some way to have some participation in this. Related to this is the idea of a liaison group. Both Senator Nunn and former Secretary of Energy Moniz, in a Washington Post article in September, made a suggestion that the chairs and the ranking minority members of key committees in both houses would review and oversee relations between U.S. and Russia. They are modeling this on an earlier Senate Arms Control Observer Group that was established in 1985 by Senators Byrd and Dole, Democrat and Republican. These met with the Secretary of State and arms control negotiators in Geneva when we were dealing with the Soviet Union. They also had opportunities to meet unofficially and informally with the Soviet delegation. And it allowed congressional members, senators in that case, and in the case of liaison group, congressional members, much more information and a kind of sense of what was at stake in these negotiations and how to talk to their own colleagues then in the Senate about the treaties that were being discussed and other foreign policy matters in the Senate. And finally, to return to Congress the authority to declare war. And that's exactly what the Markey-Liu bill is about, that Representative McGovern and now I hear 72 other co-signers have signed on to, which is terrific. But clearly, as our representatives, Congress needs to have that power. It's you know, you talk about education and health care and tax reform and all these other things, very important. But the question of war and peace, of life and death, has to be the most important decisions they make and the most important decisions we make. The proposed legislation to limit the president's first use of nuclear weapons is clearly a necessary first step. But I think to move to what I would call nuclear democracy will take more than simply limiting the president's ability to launch nuclear weapons first. I want to quote a little bit at length from Gary Will's book because, as he said, this has been going on for a long time. this lack of participation by all of us. As he says, the whole history of America since World War II caused an inertial rolling of power toward the executive branch. The monopoly on the use of nuclear weaponry, the cult of the commander-in-chief, the worldwide web of military bases to maintain nuclear alert and supremacy, the secret intelligence agencies, the whole national security state, the classification and clearance systems, the expansion of state secrets, the withholding of evidence and information, the permanent emergency that has melded World War II with the Cold War, and the Cold War with the War on Terror, all these make a vast and intricate structure that may not yield to efforts at dismantling it. 76 straight years of war emergency powers have made the abnormal normal and constitutional diminishment the settled order. This is a daunting and complex agenda. There's no doubt about that. But citizens and their representatives seem to be awakening today to the dangers of the consequence, and perhaps it's time to take advantage of this very dangerous moment in which there can be opportunity to raise the awareness and move toward nuclear democracy. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm a professor. I can't talk without PowerPoint. I too want to thank Elaine, Jonathan, all the other organizers and the sponsors of this very important event, which I think people will remember for many years after we've made the progress that we're going to make in rolling back the nuclear danger. So my comments are a little orthogonal, perhaps, to some of the other comments, partly because of my vocation as an anthropologist. I want to talk about what Elaine referred to as mental architecture earlier today. We can argue about the sort of motive force of the nuclear arms race. People will say it's inter-service rivalry between the Air Force and the Navy, or the weapons labs drive the arms race. To me, what holds the arms race in place and keeps it going is what Elaine called mental architecture. It's that mental architecture that makes it seem natural and normal to us that tens of thousands of nuclear weapons exist in the world on hair trigger alert, that stops us from thinking about them, stops us from questioning them. And so I want to talk about how that mental architecture of normality came about. So I'm an anthropologist. There's a couple of the books that I've written. For over 30 years now, I've been in dialogue with nuclear weapons scientists at both the Lawrence Livermore National Lab and the Los Alamos National Lab. I went to Livermore in 1987 to begin fieldwork with nuclear weapons scientists as an anthropologist, and I've been studying their culture, but also American public culture around nuclear weapons. And I might add, I like many of the nuclear weapons scientists enormously as individuals. They're friends. And if you're an anthropologist, you always try and be sympathetic to the people you study, to explain to others how their worldview makes sense. And to some degree, I've done that in my writing, but my writing also has this critical force where the fundamental question that animates me is understanding how the arms race and nuclear deterrence became naturalized, and how beliefs that seem to me mythical and profoundly mistaken became what the French social theorist Roland Barthes calls falsely obvious. So there are certain beliefs that are widely shared in America that I believe to be profoundly mistaken and wrong and mythical, but that are falsely obvious to a large majority of the population. And I should say that this doesn't cut across left, it cuts across left and right. It doesn't separate left and right. The two myths I'm going to talk about are widely subscribed to by liberals as well as conservatives. And when I argue with students, I find the liberal students argue as vociferously against me as conservatives. These two mythical beliefs stabilize an ideology that holds some countries can be trusted with nuclear weapons, and some cannot, can never be trusted with nuclear weapons, and that nuclear weapons protect a liberal, democratic international order. So, thus we can somehow take it for granted that the President of the US can condemn North Korea for testing a missile the same week that the US tests a ballistic missile. And no one blinks and says, well, wait a minute, isn't that hypocritical? Isn't there a double standard there? So this is what I want to push on a little bit. So the first myth is that the US is a democracy and that nuclear weapons protect this democracy. And I think Kennette sort of softened you up beautifully for me, especially that Gary Wills quote that she ended with. And Elaine's work has been very important to me, Thermonuclear Monarchy, in making the point that the US is not a democracy. When I say to my students, you know, the US is not a democracy, right? They say, you're crazy, professor. And they won't even argue it. They just say, we're not even going to argue with you because it's obvious the US is a democracy. So what is a democracy? The Oxford English Dictionary definition is it's government by the people, that form of government in which the sovereign power resides in the people as a whole and is exercised either directly by them, as in small republics of antiquity, or by officers elected by them. And in the US Constitution, it says the Congress shall have power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. So it's clear in the Oxford English Dictionary definition and in the US Constitution that a fundamental component of a democracy is that one person, a monarchical autocratic figure, should not have the sole authority to declare war, right? The reality, President Nixon, when everything was unraveling, famously said, I can go to my office, pick up the telephone, and in 25 minutes, 75 million people will be dead. A president of this country made that boast. There is nothing less democratic than that. And as Elaine Scarry says in her book, Thermonuclear Monarchy, a momentous shift in the nature of government, the home population's power of and responsibility for self-defense has been lifted away from them and condensed into the head of government. So that's the first myth. You go out in the street, you ask people, is America a democracy? 98% of them will say, yeah, sure, of course. It is not. The second myth, the US is a quote-unquote modern country with the maturity and rationality to possess nuclear weapons, unlike developing countries, unlike countries in the global south. I've called this way of looking at the world nuclear Orientalism, where it orientalizes countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, says they're too infantile, too immature, too irresponsible to be trusted with nuclear weapons. And the components of nuclear Orientalism are, one, that developing countries lack the democratic self-control required in nuclear powers. Two, that developing countries seek nuclear weapons for vanity or to gain attention and not for legitimate reasons of self-defense. Three, that fanatics are more likely to control nuclear weapons in developing countries. We see this particularly in any discussion of a Muslim country that might go nuclear. We see it a lot in the debates around Iran, for example. It's just sort of taken for granted that Muslims will destroy the world in a fit of fanaticism. And then in media coverage, you find widespread tropes that portray developing countries who want nuclear weapons either as if they're children or as if they're criminals. And I'll show you a few images of that in a minute. So some examples, and I'm deliberately picking these from left and right. The Livermore Lab, where I did my fieldwork, there's a pamphlet. Smaller nations with deep-seated grievances against each other may lack the restraint that was exercised by the US and the USSR. I obviously don't need to explain the issue there from the laughter. Kenneth Edelman, who was an official in the Reagan administration, the real danger comes from some miserable third world country which decides to use these weapons either out of desperation or incivility. I mean, there's a sort of common sense racism about that comment, right? What's just taken for granted that third world countries are not like us. When it comes to talking about democracy, this is a very recent example from Forbes magazine. Nuclear weapons are one of those sovereign rights that should not be granted to autocratic leaders. Because of this adherence to core values, global public opinion trusts Western democracies to have nuclear weapons and to use them in a defensive manner. If that's the case, there should be no problem with the no first use, right? North Korea's sovereignty inheres in just one man. Well, remember that boast by Richard Nixon that he can pick up the phone and 75 million people will be dead. So the assumption that the US is a democracy, the refusal to see how US democracy has been hollowed out by nuclear weapons, legitimates this false binary contrast. More on democracy. Bill Potter, who's a good liberal arms control analyst out in Monterey, said, adverse domestic opinion may also serve as a constraint on the acquisition of nuclear weapons by some nations. Japan, West Germany, Sweden, and Canada are examples of democracies where public opposition could have a decided effect on nuclear weapons decision. The fear of adverse public opinion, on the other hand, might be expected to be marginal for many developing nations without a strong democratic tradition. Now, what I find fascinating about an expert on nuclear weapons and nuclear history writing this is that Britain, France, and the United States all made the decision to acquire nuclear weapons with absolutely no democratic debate. There was no debate in the public sphere, and even the parliaments and the Congress in the United States were cut out of those decisions. And yet, it just seems falsely obvious that in democracies, these decisions are constrained and subject to public debate and democratic decision-making when they are not. I wrote an article around this shortly after India and Pakistan did their nuclear tests. I had a field day looking at American media coverage of those tests. So Michael Crepon, who some of you probably know, you would put in the liberal category, said India's tests weren't done for security purposes, despite the fact that India has a nuclear-armed power China on its border. They were done for reasons of domestic politics and national pride. We have street demonstrations to protest nuclear weapons. They have them to celebrate them. So in other words, we have serious reasons and they're frivolous. The New York Times opined, maybe North Korea is just jealous of all the attention Iran has been getting as a result of Tehran's recent nuclear bad behavior. Notice the language that's usually used about children, and craves a spotlight of its own. So it's been quite common in the last decade for media pundits and arms control analysts to attribute North Korea's behavior to a craving for attention, like a child acting out. And then finally, whenever the North Koreans act up, one has to assume in part that they're trying to get the world's attention. That's from Robert Einhorn, who was very high up in the State Department under President Bill Clinton, went on to Georgetown. So a lot of these assumptions made particularly visceral in cartoons. So Kim Jong-un, in particular, is often portrayed as a child who wants attention and can't be trusted with nuclear weapons. So you see a common theme going throughout these. Okay, so in conclusion, I want to say that mental architecture right now is in the process of being destabilized because the US has a president who begins to look disturbingly like Kim Jong-un, as in this picture, right? And people are seeing more and more the dichotomy between a responsible, mature, rational, democratic United States, an autocratic, impulsive, childish, can't be trusted North Korea, or Pakistan, or Iran, or India, fill in the blank, is kind of in crisis. And actually, I have found since President Trump won the election that my students in classes have begun to say things that they would not say before. I don't know if others of you teach nuclear weapons issues in universities, but in the last 10 months, students have quite explicitly brought up the subject themselves of worrying, surely he couldn't just use the weapons on his own, right? There must be some way of constraining him. And I have to say, I keep trying to tell you, it's not a democracy, no. In theory, at least, he can use the weapons on his own. And students who used to reject out of hand my arguments about nuclear Orientalism are now giving them a bit of a second look in the era of Trump. And because of comments like this, the United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself. I mean, he's talking about genocide, right? He's boasting openly that he's considering genocide as an option. Why bother having nuclear weapons if you were afraid to use them? And so the cartoonists are beginning to respond to this as well, and playing with this sort of mirroring between Trump's behavior and Kim Jong-un's. He's weird hair, maybe mentally unstable, and sends troubling messages. Right? The paranoid psycho has nuclear warheads. No, not Trump, says an American general. So, in conclusion, I think if we want to move towards a better, safer world, we have to start to dismantle that mental architecture, as well as pass bills like the act proposed by Ted Lieu. We have to start to realize that Americans do not have a monopoly on maturity and rationality. We should look in the mirror of Donald Trump and ask ourselves what it says about the United States, that it was capable of electing such a human being as president, right? We should question our own smugness about how safe nuclear weapons are in our hands. So certainly a law that would forbid the presidential first use of nuclear weapons is an excellent place to begin. But I stand with Bill Perry, our former Secretary of Defense, in the argument that he's been making with Sam Nunn, Henry Kissinger, and George Shultz, which is that given that no country has a monopoly on rationality, that any country can throw up an irrational autocratic leader at some point, the only world safe from nuclear war is a world where nuclear weapons have been abolished. And that's the horizon that we ultimately have to keep our eyes fixed on. Thank you very much.
Shall we begin with questions by the panelists of one another? Do any of you have any questions for one another? Yes. Owen?
This is to Jim McGovern, and it's really in the spirit of clarification of exactly what the proposed legislation contains or what it will contain.
What the...
Proposed legislation.
Yeah.
Okay,
So,
could I ask my question?
oh, okay, yeah, okay. I thought you asked, I thought that was the question.
The first question is to ask you, what is the relationship between this new legislation and the War Powers Resolution that Bruce Ackman spoke about earlier this morning? A lot of your arguments for this legislation are based upon the constitutional requirement that Congress shall be the one to declare war. And that there's no distinction in terms of what type of war. And as you know from the War Powers Resolution, the War Powers Resolution allows a 60 days hostility
Right.
before a ban goes in. Is it your contemplation that the no first use legislation will be a more restrictive regime than the War Powers Resolution, that this is kind of a supplement upon that when what's involved is nuclear war as opposed to conventional war? That's my first question. Second question. Earlier this morning, Rosa Brooks introduced the distinction between, I'm not quite sure her terms, so forgive me, but she introduced the distinction between nuclear bombs of a kind of catastrophic character and limited, more tailored nuclear weapons. I'm not sure the distinction exists, but she proposed it. Is that distinction one that is reflected in the legislation? Is it that you're banning all use of nuclear weapons, not just these sort of mega bombs? Often you speak about the catastrophic consequences of using nuclear weapons, but I imagine when Rosa Brooks spoke, she was thinking of more tactical weapons. I don't know if they exist, but the question is one of the scope of the ban on nuclear weapons. And the third question related to the legislation, do you contemplate prohibiting all forms of preemptive strikes? Or is it your contemplation that you're going to put bounds on what constitutes a preemptive strike? I mean, we heard this morning what Secretary Perry talked about. He wouldn't regard the stockpiling of nuclear weapons as a threat that would justify a preemptive strike. But there may be other forms of activity that would constitute preemptive strike. And the question is whether you propose to outlaw preemptive strikes altogether, provide a definition of preemptive strikes, set up some sort of procedure to make the judgment whether the preemptive strike is justified.
Okay, all right, let me see if I can remember everything here. First of all, the Markey-Liu bill, it prohibits the president from using the armed forces to conduct a first strike nuclear strike. I mean, so, how's this, better?
Yeah.
All right, okay. Yeah, so basically, the Markey-Liu bill prohibits the president from using the armed forces to conduct a first-use nuclear strike. I mean, that period, that's it. It doesn't differentiate between bigger nuclear weapons and smaller nuclear weapons. It's nuclear weapons. So that, and then the issue on preemptive strikes against countries. I mean, we have a bill that would require the president to come to Congress if he was going to launch a war against North Korea, whatever kind of war it would be. But I mean, I don't know if there's a bigger idea out there saying that we could never do a preemptive strike against anybody, but that's not pending in Congress. And the question is as to whether or not we think this would be more restrictive than the War Powers Act. I sure as hell hope so, because you know, in the sense that I think the War Powers Act has been ignored and passed over on too many occasions. I mean, I'm engaged in a big debate in Congress over the fact that these authorizations that we have for the current wars that we're now engaged in are insufficient and inadequate. You know, I tried to bring a privilege resolution to the floor to force Congress to debate and vote on whether or not we should be involved in Syria, you know, was not able to get that done. But I mean, this basically is to prevent the president, in the strongest possible terms, from being able to use his or her authority to launch a first strike nuclear strike against any country.
Isn't it the case that, I mean, since the invention of nuclear weapons, both the constitutional requirement for a declaration of war, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, and the war powers have been ignored and bypassed. Right. But leaving that question aside, isn't it the case that the constitutional requirement for a declaration of war is actually much stronger than the War Powers Act? I mean, it may be that in Bruce Ackerman's case, it's completely right to use the War Powers Resolution for that case, but it's not actually as strong as the absolute requirement by the Constitution that Congress declare war. Yeah, Bruce?
The evasions of the war power clause of the Constitution begins with the Barbary Pirates and the decision by President Jefferson to unilaterally use force against the Barbary Pirates. And over the arc of American history until 1973, there were 5 declarations of war and many uses of unilateral presidential power. That's what the Monroe Doctrine is all about. Now, after 1973, it is a false to say that the War Powers Resolution was ignored. Simply false. Gerald Ford recognized the War Powers Resolution, and that's what got him into this mess in Lebanon. Ronald Reagan recognized the War Powers Resolution. We can go on and on. The crucial, as I mentioned to you, the War Powers Resolution was recognized even by Bill Clinton in Kosovo. And the question then became what happened when there was a peace agreement. The crucial moment of violation, the War Powers Resolution was recognized by George Bush in 2001 and 2002. So the period what we're talking about in which the War Powers Resolution was not recognized, although it was officially recognized by the Bush administration in the second term and the Obama administration, is the last 10 years. I'm representing the ghost of Jacob Javits. All of your arguments were made by Jacob Javits, not in terms of this narrow issue, which of course I totally agree with you on the narrow issue of nuclear. And he won. There were massive public marches, peace marches, and that's what permitted Jacob Javits to win in 1973. The idea that if Jim McGovern and Markey win, then as if it, it will be respected by the next president who, why do you think so? What are the checks? What are the mechanisms of control? What are the mechanisms when the president says, well, we can simply make war with nuclear weapons? What checks are there in this statute? There aren't any. It's just another declaration, weaker than the War Powers Resolution, because, of course, the president can veto your appropriations bills. He can veto your legislation. And you have it.
He can veto this, and we could override him.
Yes,
if we had
you
a
can
movement.
override
Right.
it, just as Senator Javits already did. But Senator Javits placed the burden of further authorizations on the president. If he doesn't get 60 days, he can't do it anymore. And that's the crucial thing, whether you're going to enforce that. We have to coordinate. All three of you spoke as if the War Powers Resolution never was enacted. And you are, well, no, in fact, as a matter of fact, all three of you simply didn't mention it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Could I just make an observation in terms of using nuclear weapons and the War Powers Act? We're focused on first use, but I'm also thinking about it's in the nature of the technology. Once you have MIRVed missiles that can strike multiple targets at once, that you inevitably have to set up a machinery where the president can give the command to use nuclear weapons under attack without consulting other people. As Bruce pointed out in his talk earlier today, the time is so compressed that there's barely even time to wake up the president if it's the middle of the night and get him to make a decision. Which is why I come back to my final point, which is Bill Perry's point, that as long as the weapons exist, they will create the structural situation where we have to surrender our authority to use them to a president who's worried about using them or losing them. Could I ask Congressman McGovern a question?
Yeah, but I definitely want to hear your question to Congressman McGovern. But I just want to say that I think you're being circular, Bruce. I mean, you're looking at a population that, as has been said, has been infantilized. You're looking at a constitution that has been set aside, and now you're imagining that how could you possibly enforce a constitution? Well, constitutions are enforced when people stand behind it, when they put their name to it, when they put their heart to it, and if they do it, absolutely it will be enforceable. And I think that if you put the 1811 requirement into effect, and it's sequelae in the War Powers Resolution, which is based on 1811, then it will have enforcement. It's just that it's circular. We can't imagine at this point because we've already been read out. But once you eliminate nuclear weapons on the basis of this, and I believe that that's possible, then it will reanimate your belief in this as a self-enforcing doctrine. You can go ahead and ask your question.
So I have a question for Congressman McGovern about Republicans.
Okay.
So I live in Washington, and I hear around town that Republicans, if you talk to them one-on-one, off-camera, they're deeply troubled by the president's behavior. But in public, they won't say that, and party discipline is such that it's very hard to get them to vote against him or to come together and condemn him for some of his statements. So I'm wondering, in terms of this bill, the Lou Markey bill, are Republicans just against it, or is it another of these issues where if you talk to them over a drink one-on-one, they can be quite supportive of it, but they would never vote for it?
Yeah. So, yeah, it is true that it's, that Republicans are a little bit more difficult to deal with in this Congress than even in previous Congresses, in part because I think they're afraid of the president, and they're afraid of a primary challenge in particular. And this president, still holds a strong support amongst Republican primary voters, like in the 80%, 81%. So they don't want to take him on or be on his wrong side because they feel they'll lose their primary. Hopefully, they'll lose their general if they keep that attitude. But the bottom line is that's what a lot of the fear comes from. I think a lot of the Republicans that I talk to, I think are very worried about these statements, especially the ones that you put up on the screen here today. I think that they roll their eyes a lot, but they're afraid to kind of take a public stand because they're afraid of what might come after them if they do. On this issue, I think that there's probably a fair number of Republicans who probably agree with us on this. I don't think it's just kind of a knee-jerk, I'm against anything because, deals with arms control or because it might clip the president's wings. But the question is whether or not they'll have the courage to actually put their name on the bill or vote on it if the president lobbies hard against it, which if it came to the floor, I'm sure he would. But that's where the pressure comes up. I think the one thing Republicans and Democrats all have in common is we all want to get reelected. And I think people have more power than they realize. If a group this size showed up at a member's office or a senator's office, it would be noticed. And I think it's that kind of pressure that we need to exert here. But I don't think the Republicans are a lost cause. The fact that Senator Corker is going to be holding a hearing on this tells me that, he's open to this idea.
Is there any hope that there might be a requirement, either in law or in international treaties, that differences must be solved by negotiation?
Well,
that's what I believe, but I don't know how you put, how you.
Well, by deliberation, just to begin with, the requirement for a declaration of war by Congress is a requirement for deliberation. And international deliberation. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty that requires the nuclear states to get rid of their arsenals and is a condition of all the other people who have abstained from getting nuclear weapons from continuing to abstain, that is a requirement that they deliberate about it and negotiate in order to reduce it, which they have not done. But I want to maybe just say something about deliberation for one moment, because Rosa mentioned this morning, and I think somebody else mentioned too, the fact that in a hierarchy you don't have deliberation, and this is an absolutely crucial point. I look at, for example, the 5 cases where we had a congressional deliberation of war, and the quality of the deliberation is extremely high. They are testing what it means to call another country an enemy, and they are trying to unmask it. And they all consider themselves equal, so they feel completely at liberty to dress down the oppositional argument. In the presidential papers where people are considering using an atomic weapon, there is zero contesting of what the president wants. So in Eisenhower, in the Taiwan Straits crisis in 1954, the closest thing to an act of dissent is Secretary of the Treasury Humphrey saying, aren't we going to have a hard time explaining to the American people why these little islands with names they don't know, like Matsu and Quemoy, are important enough that we dropped an atomic weapon? Eisenhower dresses him down. A mere look at the wall will convince you of the importance of the strategic position of these islands. End of debate. No one says, I kind of agree with Humphrey. In '59, in Berlin, an even more egregious example, Eisenhower is considering using an atomic bomb in Berlin, and by that point, he's invited a couple of senators there on the preposterous idea that by having a couple of senators and congressmen there, you would fulfill the requirement for a congressional declaration. And Fulbright says, I just want to make sure I understand the conversation that's going on. Are you saying that East German people might take out the Autobahn, and that we might, and the West German side might begin to build it, and that a rifleman might shoot the West German, and then we would drop an atomic bomb? And Eisenhower says, we're not exactly sure of the steps that would lead up to the dropping of the atomic bomb. He doesn't say that this is madness. Of course, we would do nothing so preposterous. In contrast, the deliberations in Congress are magnificent. I mean, there are features you can point out that are embarrassing, like the racist language against Japan. But in general, the quality of actually testing the proposition that another country has done something that warrants inflicting this tremendous injury on them and on your own soldiers. And to go to Kennette's point about the citizenry working hand in hand with this, like World War I deliberations, 50,000 citizens are talked about in those deliberations, folded in petitions and citations from the congressmen and senators. I mean, it's just completely different than anything in the presidential papers. Because, again, once you have that hierarchy, you don't have deliberation. You have people who have recognized the stature of the person at the top. Yes.
Apropos the mental architecture, I'd like to add one more item to Professor Gusterson's mythology. The idea that military spending boosts the economy. You've got that. I think the power of money is something that we have to consider. There are expensive election campaigns, there's Citizens United, there's McCutcheon, and there are donors. We have to weigh that as well, I think.
Do you want to respond? Yes. Oh, sorry. Over there, and then we'll come to the side. In the middle?
Kennette, this is John Burroughs. I was really glad to hear you talk
John.
about the nuclear posture review that's currently under preparation. My organization has sent in submissions to the preparers of the NPR, have heard nothing back. We proposed public process regarding the NPR. Do you have any ideas about how we could get more public engagement with the NPR now under preparation? And I would note there was just an article in The Guardian saying that this new nuclear posture review is likely to loosen guidelines for use of nuclear weapons from what was in the Obama nuclear posture review. And I wonder if Representative McGovern has any ideas about how Congress and the public could become involved in the preparation of the nuclear posture review.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The nuclear posture review usually results in some kinds of budget recommendations for weapons, so there is a way in which Congress can be involved in budget discussions. But and I think you are really very right to send in your own suggestions about nuclear posture review. I think it's a tremendously difficult process to crack, and it is treated with so much secrecy, and there's so much interest in keeping it secret that I think it'll be quite a while before there's even congressional input into the posture review. I know that under Obama, the posture review, I think there were 187 meetings or something among the agencies and among the various military forces to come up with a posture review which wasn't much different from earlier ones. So it's a exceedingly incremental process. But I think if there begins to be, again, citizen focus on that, on this arcane review of our forces, and questions raised about, well, how many are there? Where are they? What is the targeting? I think we can begin to try and at least insert questions into the process so that we open it up. But it's part of the review is part of just a much larger edifice of nuclear monarchy, and it's one that we're going to take, it will take a long time to crack. I guess the related question that I have, and maybe Representative McGovern can also address this, is that I've heard that congressional members really kind of don't want to take responsibility for nuclear weapons. They've got a lot of things on their plate, as the most of us do, and that it's taking on another layer of things that they really aren't sure they want to be answerable for, accountable for. So we have to, in the first instance, get congressional members to understand that it's in their interest to begin to pay attention to nuclear weapons issues and to begin to press for more participation in very consequential decisions.
Yeah, well, I think how Congress gets involved with the nuclear posture review. When you said that, I thought that sounded like an interesting idea. I'm not quite sure the steps that we need to take to actually get more involved or how it would work, but I'd be open to learning more about that, and because I think we need to pay more attention to what's going on. Yeah, Congress has a lot on its plate, but nuclear weapons is a big deal. I mean, if this goes wrong, we all die. So I can't think of anything more important. I think sometimes, I think it is accurate, though, to say that sometimes Congress doesn't want to take responsibility on tough questions, and getting into a debate in this political climate over nuclear weapons or the size of our military budget, I think some members are a little bit nervous. Same is true about wars. I mean, getting members of Congress to take responsibility for these wars that are going on has been a difficult thing to do. People don't want to debate them right now because they don't want to take a side. If they take the wrong side and it turns out that things go the wrong way, then they don't want to be held responsible. It's a lot easier to be in Congress and point fingers when things don't go well than it is to take responsibility. And so I guess even though these are uncomfortable, that's where political pressure comes into play. I mean, we run for office not just to hold the office, for the joy of it. I mean, you have to work at things that sometimes are not easy and sometimes are politically, hazardous. And so it's probably true that a lot of these important issues have been put to the side because of, Congress has purposely tried to find ways not to deal with it. But we need to change that. We really need to change that.
Can I just add something about the nuclear posture review? I think Kennette is quite right that enormous effort goes into producing a document that is only minorly different from the document that came before it. There's a lot of argument about slight shifts in emphasis. But if the word on the street in Washington is correct, that will not be true of the nuclear posture review that's currently being prepared. Rumors are that it will change American nuclear policy in a declaratory way in quite significant ways. And rumor has it that it's largely being prepared in some right-wing think tanks. So it's the very antithesis of a democratic process. Colin Gray, who some of you may know from his article, Victory is Possible, in the Reagan years, that you could win a nuclear war, apparently is particularly influential in drafting it.
I'd like to raise a question from a young colleague of
Can
mine
you
that had...
speak more loudly?
Oh, is it working? It's closer. Okay. I'd like to raise a question from a young colleague of mine who had to leave, and since there haven't been many questions aired from young people here today, I think it's important, and I'd like to address it to Kennette Benedict. She said, how can civil society, and especially young people, take action to support the adoption of no first use and ultimately nuclear abolition? In reference to Rosa Brooks's words, how can we feel the threat in our bones when the issue seems so far away and foreign to us? What message would you give to the younger generation who will carry forth this mission?
Thank you for the question. I think there are some organizations, Global Zero is one, Bruce Blair is right here, who started it, and there are some other organizations. I think I take great heart in the fact that the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons was led mostly by young people. Certainly Tim Wright and Beatrice Finn are, I would call them young, and they've brought together a coalition of some 460 organizations, which is really tremendous. So on an international scale, I think there's possibility for participation in a way that I don't think we've seen for a while, and the fact that they were able to work with the UN to get a treaty in place, no matter whether you think it was a great treaty or not, at least it was one that made a statement about the role of nuclear weapons in the world and the way they see them, those weapons being used. So I think there are possibilities, certainly now, more than we've seen in the past. And given the heartening words from Representative McGovern and Senator Markey, I think they've given us our marching orders. In fact, I think Dianne Feinstein said in her hearing, go out on the streets. So I think we've got some support from some congressional members. I think that the issue of how do we think about nuclear weapons is one that is tough. We're far from, thankfully, from the use of nuclear weapons in World War II, where we saw many of our generation, my generation, felt the almost palpable nature of the weapons in our duck and cover exercises and in the kind of media coverage, which gives you chills. But I also believe that that kind of attempt to make these a visceral issue can also produce some fear and anxiety to the point perhaps even of paralysis. So what I've tried to think about is the fact that the power to make these decisions about life and death are in the hands of one, maybe two people, and that is really unfair. It is just not fair. We have a right to whether we live or die. I mean, like the women's movement or the abolition of slavery or the anti-war movement, we have rights, and we have rights to participate in these most grave decisions. Maybe we'll decide nuclear weapons are great, who knows? I don't think so. But the point to me is that the very successful movements, I think, that we've seen in this country, and they have been very successful, are ones built on the idea that we have rights and that we have rights to be free, we have rights to participate and participate in an equal way. And so, yes, we should be fearful. These are horrible things. They are, weapons of destruction, of just incalculable destruction. And the way you die from radiation sickness is just gross. I mean, your skin comes off, you start bleeding out of your eyes. It's an awful way to die. Sid Drell, a scientist who worked on, who was a great anti-nuclear weapons guy, said, a student once asked him, well, what should I do if the nuclear weapon is dropped? And he said, run towards it. because it's such an awful, awful prospect. But I guess I think I've come to think that rather than scaring the hell out of people, which maybe you need to do at first, although I'll tell you, I teach, at the University of Chicago, and it doesn't take much to scare them. What it takes more to do is to motivate. And I think the question really is, how do we want to live in our world? Do we want to live as, upright citizens with rights to make decisions? Or do we want to live in cowering fear as infants and children who are talked down to all the time about what we should think about the most consequential issues that we deal with?
With that very eloquent summary, I think we'll end the panel.